Greetings, greetings, greetings. It is I, David Stewart. I wanted to make a brief, I would say brief, I never quite mean it, brief video on historical fiction and historical fantasy and why I think readers are attracted to the historical fiction genre and what I think they get out of it, why it's enjoyable for a lot of people to read historical fiction. A little bit of background and context. I wrote a historical fiction book. Here it is. It's called Muramasa Blood Drinker. You can actually get the ebook for free this weekend only, so if you haven't picked it up yet and you're one of my regular viewers, now's the time to go ahead and grab it for free. Links will be down below in the description. It's totally free this weekend, so you can take a chance without any sort of monetary risk on it. It takes place in late Muromachi period Japan, which is a setting that I really enjoyed. And that really gets me to the first big reason that people like historical fiction is they like the setting of it. A lot of people have a lot of interest in past historical periods and other places and other cultures in time. And when you read a historical fiction book, you get to experience that setting in the context of a story that you care about. Sort of some of the same reasons that people enjoy fantasy settings is that the setting itself is something of interest and something of value. You can, in turn, get to know some characters that have different sensibilities from you or from what would happen in a contemporary setting. Some characters who have different morals, different viewpoints. They have different views of what is possible and impossible because of the constraints of their setting and their history and their culture and those sorts of things. And also a reader gets to learn a lot about a possible history or culture or past place that they don't know that much about. And I think that is something that I think readers find really, really attractive because it has to do with the way that we understand realities, that we tend to not just remember facts. What we tend to remember is stories. And I've talked about this in other videos talking about the news narrative and why that's so powerful and effective when it comes to rhetoric and things like that. And that's because we don't really remember facts, but when we have the facts constructed in a story, we tend to remember the story because that puts it in context. We have a sequence of events that have meaning attached to them and those sorts of things. So when we get to read a historical fiction book, we get to know that period of history and possibly some of the historical events that surround that period in history through the mechanism of a story which has meaning and impact and lends some context to those things and gets us a little bit more interested in taking those ideas and putting them in a place where we can understand them fully. So just as an example, if you were to open up a history book and read something about late Muromachi period Japan, like early 16th century, which is where this story takes place, you might read about Ashikaga Yoshitane, and you're like, okay, he was shogun, and then he was deposed, and then he was shogun again, and you don't quite remember the dates, and you don't quite remember why it happened, or like what the shogunate's all about. We take that time period, we put it into a story, and all of a sudden we meet him as a character, we meet the Kanrei as a character, we understand some more of the politics because we get to know some characters that are deeply in the politics of that feudal system, and it just puts the facts that might be kind of dry and difficult to remember into a place where they're easy to remember and they have meaning and impact on us. They have an emotional impact on us, and that means they're easier to access later on, understand to a greater degree. So that's one of the things that I think people who read historical fiction get really attracted to is they may already like the historical period and then they get to know a story in it. They may not know that much about it, but get to learn about the historical period, which I think is fun. And of course, all the characters have and do things that are not typical for a contemporary setting. And lastly, it takes that historical period and all the facts and all the events that are in it and puts it in a place that people can have an emotional attachment to and an understanding of with a broader and deeper, not a broader, but a deeper context of what those historical events meant. And I think people tend to really, really enjoy that. So that's why I think people are pretty attracted to historical fiction. You can get my book, my historical fiction book, on Amazon. Please leave me your comments down below and let me know what you think about why people enjoy historical fiction. I will leave you with a slight caution, is that not all historical fiction is historically accurate. And this is often a point of discussion for a lot of pedants on the internet and indeed the world in general. of whom I am one, by the way. I tend to be a little bit of a pedant when it comes to some things about history. Arms and armor in particular, I'm very, very interested in how those actually worked in context. And so if you watch a lot of HEMA channels, you'll see them kind of rip apart shows who just sort of use weapons in a fantastical way or in a way they think is flashy and appealing to a viewer rather than an accurate way. And depending on your view of historical fiction, that may not be a good thing. You may not want people watching historical fiction and thinking that this is the way people dress and the way they acted in whatever time period that is, when it in fact was not the way that they acted. And that's the caution, because a lot of people like to know about historical periods through historical fiction because it's more fun. So the caution is sort of being a little bit historically inaccurate, and other people have a viewpoint that it's all about the story and who cares about the accuracy of the history. I tend to care more about the accuracy of history because I think that makes it part of the setting, which keeps things interesting and keeps the characters true to themselves. And if you didn't want to sort of adhere to the history of it too strictly, and I don't adhere super strictly because this definitely has some supernatural elements, but if you didn't want that setting in particular, you probably should have just written a fantasy story. Great example that I think of is Braveheart, which won a bunch of Academy Awards, and I actually think it's a well-made movie, but it's not historically accurate. They're wearing like belted plaid in, I think, the 13th century whenever the story takes place, and belted plaid wasn't really a thing until like a couple hundred years later. And they're also wearing all their kilts backwards, so they wear their kilts, usually you pull it over the front, they're wearing it like from the front over the back or something. It's kind of a weird look when you're used to seeing Highland attire that's actually, accurate. So it's one of those things. And then the defense of it was like, well, these were the elements that spoke to me with this piece of historical fiction. And yeah, the events don't match history and things like that. And it's like, well, a lot of it just really doesn't match history. And that's the caution, is that it could be historically inaccurate. But most of the time, I think historical fiction authors are really concerned with being pretty accurate and getting the feel of that particular time period, because that's what I think readers tend to be really interested in. So you guys have a great day. I will see you next time. Muramasa Blood Drinker is, of course, up right now, and I hope that you will grab it if you have not grabbed it yet.